So, hello again. This is Gail Cameron from my Pocket Coach Leadership Series. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to our interview today a young and dynamic woman leader in the ever-changing ICT sector with an impressive track record in the public and academic spheres. This leadership has been highly influential in shaping the landscape and her industry. She is a trusted advisor to government leadership and has provided leadership insights on ICT strategies that drive innovation and digital transformation. A very warm welcome, Charmaine Houvet.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Gail. Much appreciated. And it's an honor for me to actually chat to you. Such a, I think a shifter who's helped many people that I know on their own leadership and transformation journey. Thank you for the opportunity.
So lovely to have you here. So, you're an advisor to our President's Fourth Industrial Revolution Commission, which harnesses emerging technologies for economic and societal progress. You're also a board member of the International Women's Forum of South Africa and chairman of Cisco's Charitable Trust Foundation. But you were just telling me as you came on the interview that you've just returned from the UN. Tell us about this fascinating initiative through the Clinton Foundation.
Yes, so it's been such an honor for me. And I was actually just telling my leader friend Katsudis a few days ago that I was so touched by her always involving me on an annual basis to attend the sideline meetings at the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, and very key to the various activities that take place in New York. And there's so many during ANGA, and I get involved in so many of them, but the two or three that stand out for me annually is the Clinton Global Initiative, which is led by Hillary Clinton, as well as President Bill Clinton and Chelsea Clinton. And it's a gathering of thought leaders. It's a gathering of global leaders, world leaders, change makers, philanthropists, a whole host of people around the globe who come together to drive change, ranging from climate change, poverty, homelessness, education, health, a whole range of issues where leaders pledge support depending on where their organizations or their individual focuses lie. And it's, you have people from like the senator leader of Nassau, who came and spoke about, when he tracks and looks at the world at large and the globe and how climate change is real. And as he starts to track the different satellites, and he sees that there's only so little that time that we have, and so much that we need to do as individuals to protect the earth and to conserve the planet, all the way through to leaders from organizations like Bill Gates, who came and spoke about the power of quantum computing and artificial intelligence, and why at the heart of all of this we have to remember humanity. And we must never forget that technology at the end of the day should be tech for good in all forms, and it should be solving problems for citizens and not creating additional problems for these citizens. To heads of state who spoke about how they need to reset and encourage economic transformation and development for citizens, especially Africa's youth who are rising, to the elderly who need to be cared for, and where policies need to be transformed, and we need to be much more committed to doing good, to philanthropists who are leaning in and engaging about how do we ensure that we protect so many women from gender-based violence and femicide and trafficking, to Prince Harry, who spoke about every single one of us have screensavers of our children on our devices, and yet it's our children who are most under threat from the freeness and availability of technology. And therefore, as parents, our responsibility is to ensure that we protect their fragile young minds. So really powerful 2 days of not just conversations, but commitments. Organizations announcing how they are going to be pledging and actually addressing all of these complex issues that have been laid bare. And we also had President Biden come and talk about the real challenges that the US is facing with the run off to the elections and the different things that the Democrats and Republicans are doing to come together as one. So really, eye-opening for me as a South African citizen who works on the continent for Cisco. And then another big one for me was the Global Citizen event, where apart from the big concert that happens in Central Park, Global Citizen is an organization that addresses poverty, it alleviates poverty and social inequalities, and a whole host of other things around education, health. And, there's so many side conversations where I had the opportunity to meet a few South African leaders who attended some of the breakfast conversations and sessions. And again, a powerful movement that it's very difficult for you to buy a ticket. You have a seat at the table and a seat at Central Park for the concert by doing good, by actually logging on to their app and actually, actually making sure that you accumulate points because you've done good. You've either gone to a shelter and you've fed the homeless, or you've actually participated in an elderly home and you've given care to the elderly, or you've gone out to a school and you've helped do good at a school. So it's all acts of kindness and acts of giving, which is so important, Gail. It's something that we are so lacking and missing today.
Yes.
And then the powerful concert that ends up with a lot of these powerful global artists. I know Doja Cat was there, and Malone, and so many others who I didn't know many of them, and my children were telling me how powerful these are. But again, a lot of them give of their time to the concert, and then all of this good is sent back to institutions, to NGOs, and to government. So so many powerful things that were happening, and it actually reinstills that faith that as citizens and as humanity, we are really and truly slowly evolving in our consciousness in terms of kindness and giving back.
Such a privilege to have this exposure at this high level. How wonderful is that? But I'd like to go back a little bit, and I want you to tell me a little about Charmaine and how did her incredible journey start?
So I actually, Gail, very interesting, and maybe this is why kindness matters to me and being that voice matters. I was raised by my grandmother. My father was actually a functioning alcoholic, which meant that he was diagnosed with being an alcoholic, but he woke up every day and he went to work and he participated in day-to-day social activities. But he never had the tools and the know-how in those days in terms of how to deal with it. Also very challenging because it was at the height of apartheid that I grew up. I was raised in a largely colored community. So again, because of segregation and because of Group Areas Act, I actually was raised in what was then known as the barracks, a structure that has since been razed to the ground and removed because the democratic government went and had a look at these housing facilities for colored and Black people and realized that people should have never been placed there in the first place. It was actually soldiers' barracks where lots of colored people were relocated from Cato Manor and other places and placed in these barracks, and soldiers were then moved out because of the place was just inhabitable. And so we were actually placed there in these cramped 4-roomed houses where we all just slept either on the floor in the lounge or in the kitchen or wherever there was a space, and grew up in an environment that was epitomized by drugs, prostitution, crime, alcoholism. It was a really tough environment to grow up in. I went to a government school, and I even remember growing up, it struck me hard just how poor we were, because at that point in time, I think school fees was something like 2 rand, and my grandmother couldn't afford to even pay school fees. So I was always in trouble because we just couldn't afford school fees. And again, because my grandmother was my guardian, social workers would often come and check on me, check on school, check on the progress. And I remember, even as I'm talking to you now, something struck in my head that I've worked my whole life with in terms of addressing through therapy, through coaching, through counseling, was the deep shame. I never knew at that point in time that I felt shame. It was only when I was much older. And I remember Brene Brown coming to Cisco and running workshops and talking to us about the power of vulnerability and the power that many people are walking around with in terms of allowing themselves to be vulnerable. And there's power in vulnerability and letting go of shame. And the penny dropped that, oh my goodness, that's what I've been struggling with. I've been struggling with feeling shame for something that I had no control over. I had no responsibility for being an orphan or a guardian of an elderly sick grandmother. I had no power and contribution to going to a government school and being unable to show up and to pay school fees. I had no shame in not having the latest uniforms, all of these things. And so therein started my journey in terms of unpacking and letting go and forgiving and reflecting. And, so that past and that responsibility was, strangely enough, the very thing that got me to the very first time I started in the workplace when I was 16 or 17. Again, I had to leave work. I had to finish off school in matric and immediately go and look and see how I could start working to provide for myself. I was 17 years old, living alone in a little studio apartment and taking care of myself, because then my grandmother passed away and I had to go and look after myself. But then my father was too sickly to do anything. And I had to, with the little money I was earning, also take care of him and put him through care as well. And I had to then do correspondence studying while I was working in a little admin role, an admin job. But even in all of that chaos happening, the one thing that growing up in a tough neighborhood taught me, growing up in poverty, but with love, pure, sheer, utter love and protection and care for my grandmother, it taught me that I should never be quiet about the struggles of others. So therein, with all of its controversies and all of its pain and all of its chaos, I found a light from above. I found a light that came to me and made me realize that I can't be silent in the face of adversity. And that's where I found my voice in this chaos of the corporate environment. I found my voice when I looked around and I saw people quiet, I saw people afraid, I saw the fear. I recognized me and I thought, oh my goodness, that's me. I'm that fearful person. And nobody ever spoke up for me. So I should never, ever be quiet. So very interesting and chaotic upbringing, Gail, but with tools of therapy, with tools of coaching, with tools of mentors and so many other things. I find myself here having this honor and the gratitude of actually speaking to somebody like you today.
That's an incredible journey. And, how wonderful to have those defining moments and to recognize, your pain and how you'll translate that pain into somebody else's benefit. So you're also very passionate about women's empowerment, especially young women. Why?
Again, as I said, what fascinates me, and I see it today, by the way, it's I don't believe it's ever been addressed or removed, because again, it takes a consciousness and it takes a conscious effort that many of us unfortunately don't possess in the workplace, because my journey is not unique to the journey of so many leaders, especially female leaders and our allies, male leaders in the workplace. Many have not had that luxury and the privilege that I have had of having a mentor in the room who recognized that I'm angry, who recognized that I'm hurting, who recognized that I'm feeling left out, and who recognized that I'm feeling basically, somewhat disadvantaged. And I was very fortunate. When I was about 19 or 20, I had a mentor, Leon Mostert, who worked with me, who back then looked at me and recognized this. And he said, I've got a little daughter, Charmaine, and when I look at you, I see her. And I see that you're angry. I see that you're hurting. I see that you feel neglected. And I see that you're just not fitting in. And again, it was tough. I was the first person of color, or the first colored person as defined in South Africa. I was the first colored person in the workplace. And there was nobody who looked like me. There was nobody who had my experiences or my upbringing. There was a colleague who was Indian, who was the only person who I could relate with. And her and I, she was maybe 2 years older than I was, and we were literally just the two of us alone. And there were often so many disparaging comments and insulting comments, which I, at the time, and I mean, of course, being a 17-year-old 18-year-old youngster in a corporate environment, having the background that I had, I took everything as offense. So when somebody looks at me and said, "Oh, why do you speak so funny?" It took me weeks to lift myself off of the floor. When somebody said to me, "Oh, you've got very strange textured hair," it took me days and days and months to actually get that in my head. When people would make comments about people of color, it would stab me in the heart and I could barely breathe. I took everything at offense because I didn't have the tools back then. And in comes Leon Moss and he says, "I'm going to work with you." And it just so happened that he was doing his MBA, and a core components of his MBA was psychology and coaching and business leadership. And he then, without me knowing the word, I didn't know the word at 18, 19. I didn't know that this was somebody called a mentor who called me in and sat me down and said to me, "No, there was a different way you could have said that, Charmaine. There was a different way that you could have shown up. You didn't have to say this. How about in future you do this? Here's a book that I think you should read. Hey, by the way, you know what? If you're wanting to expand your studies, do you know that University of South Africa is doing X, Y, and Z?" And in those days, University of South Africa was a lifeline for many of us who came straight from government schooling and didn't have funds or didn't have contacts or the means to actually enter any other university. And he helped me and guided me through that process. And it's only today that I look back and I realize he was a mentor. And even then, in my little admin role where I was just earning my little pennies, my first salary was about, I remember receiving it in cash, was about 700 Rand. And he then said to me, "Look, you should invest in X, Y, and Z. And what you should do once you start investing, you need to then apply for bigger roles." And then I realized only today that he was also a sponsor. So not only was he a mentor to me, he was also a sponsor. And the older I got and the more I started to bump across these people in roles as I started to progress in the corporate environment, I then again sat down and the consciousness touched me that, oh, wow, I was quite fortunate in the work environment. I had a very present mentor. I had a very present sponsor. I had a very present coach, and I had a very present leader in my life. And it's decades later, and Leon and I are still in touch with each other. I still reach out to him for guidance. I still reach out to him and I update him on my life. I update him on the transformations in my life, the transitions, where I'm at, what I'm doing. And, I've never lost that relationship and I never will. And this is something that touched me in thinking, here during the height of apartheid, I was working in an organization. Here is this white gentleman who previously never had any interaction with people of color. He looks at me and he thinks, here's a project for me. And whatever his motivations were, it was irrelevant to me, but he invested in me. And when I started to look around at so many other people who didn't have that opportunity, and I would see that pain in them, and I'd see the rejection, and I'd hear the hurt when we were in team meetings, and I'd hear also look at them, looking around. And there was a time post the democratic elections, 1996, 1997, the workplace started being flooded finally with African, Indian, and colored people. And finally, I could sense that sense of camaraderie that I've got other people who can now recognize my struggle. And finally, we can form movements and we can form conversation groupings and we can start to help people understand who we are. And that all we want to do is just come and work. We just want to also provide for our families. And I heard so many of these youngsters joining who didn't want to get involved because they were afraid. They were afraid to make their voices heard. They were afraid to speak up because they would get into trouble. Or they were afraid to speak up because they felt that, they would be isolated and they would be victimized. And that's when the movement started for me to start to be that voice. And again, with Leon's guidance in my ear saying, there's a certain way to do it. Appeal to your vulnerabilities. Talk to the fear of others when you're asking a leader to intervene in something. Find out why they're afraid to make that change and talk to them around. Make sure that you find that thing in them. Listen more. Take a step back. And also, Charmaine, you've got to drop the feeling of defense and attack. Not everything is a defense. Not everything needs to be defended. You don't always have to suit up and put on your armor. So that's what really got me going in terms of looking at the vulnerable girl, Charmaine, who walked into a space and there was very few people. In fact, no one stood up and spoke up for me. Everybody was so deeply rooted and suited in their corporate life And there was one gentleman who took a risk and stood up for me and encouraged me to speak. And there were even days, Gail, I remember incidents in my career where I cried trying to put my point across, or my voice shook and I would choke up because I couldn't put my point across. So now when I see it in a room or when I see it, that's what causes me to be more conscious and speak up for others.
Oh, beautiful. Why do you think it's become a strategic imperative that women should be accelerated into positions of leadership? What is it about women's as leaders, that makes them different and it's important and special?
A few years ago, I had the privilege of working with McKinsey on a project in one of the work environments I worked in. And while we were working on this project for Africa, one of the McKinsey partners told me about a project that they were working on called Women Matter. And it was a global study that they did, and it was very interesting. The study pointed out that in roles and in organizations in countries where women were leaders, the organization showed up to a 20% increase in terms of profits, and even more in terms of productivity when women were at the helm of that organization. And I remember back then myself and my then new mentor, Advocate Omar Rasataba, who is now in the National Prosecuting Authority, her and I then put our heads together, and she was such a powerful advocate as well. Again, I was so blessed to have her as my mentor, as my leader, as my coach in that organization. Her and I put our heads together and we said to McKinsey, let's do a study for Africa. Let's see if the same holds true for Africa. And of course, the same held true for the globe and for Africa. And then we rolled out the McKinsey Women Matter study for Africa. And the studies basically showed that no longer, and this was decades ago, the study showed that no longer can we afford to leave anybody out of a leadership conversation. We need to look at diversity. We need to look at inclusion. And we need to meet people at their need. And we need to meet people at their moment. And this study opened up so many amazing things for me that in the past, there was always an authority. And even today, I love how when you sit at the table, there's always somebody who is an authority on everything. They are the voice of reason. They are the voice of everything, and nobody else's voice matters because they know it all. And gone are those days, Gail. It's just not the case anymore. Nowadays, you're hearing more and more of an appeal to humanity from the millennials, from the Gen Zs, from the Gen Ys, from the younger generation, where even now you have so many organizations, even in board meetings, leaving an empty seat at the table. And that empty seat is often left to represent those who have not yet joined in the workforce, because we are all being asked that, look, everybody's voice, women, youth, the disabled, veterans, everybody's voice matters, because oftentimes I would see it growing up. The person that I took a lot of guidance and direction from was my grandmother, because I didn't understand again until later on that she could barely read and write, but I never picked that up in growing up, because she didn't show herself up with her wisdom, that she had life wisdom and life lessons. And even growing up, I remember the women in our communities were the people who kept the communities together, because oftentimes the men in the communities had to go and work out in the mines, or they went out into the fields and they were barely there, but it was the women who kept us together. And so when I think of the wisdom of the elders that today is often neglected, when I think even as a child growing up, I was often told children are seen, children are heard, so therefore you don't have a voice, you don't have an opinion. That's how I was raised, that you shouldn't have to have an opinion, you don't know anything. And that's something that I see is transitioning so drastically nowadays. So we need everybody's voice at the boardroom table. It's not one voice that dominates anymore. And if we are going to strive towards diversity, we are going to strive towards inclusion, we are going to try and ensure that change is made for all. Because again, we say that we are driving an inclusive future for all. And all doesn't mean that it's only my voice. That is, all means that each and every person who needs to drive that full spectrum inclusion has to be included in terms of change.
I love that, because I really believe none of us is as clever as all of us. So I love that. So how's South Africa doing, in terms of appointing women into board appointments?
Still very poorly. If I look at the ICT sector where I come from, there is still roughly about 24% of us in the field, which is, and even if as I talk to you now and I cast my mind through the big mobile operators, I cast my mind through a lot of the multinationals who are in the country right now, and even just on the continent. And I think of chairmen of boards, CEOs of companies, CFOs of companies. Of course, we definitely much better off than where we were before. But I think of a picture I saw about a month ago, or maybe I think it was in August month. I saw a photo on LinkedIn, and it was when the new Minister of ICT was appointed under the Government of National Unity. And I don't know what the origins of the meeting were, but he had called together all of the CEOs of the ICT sector, and there was a meeting, and clearly after the meeting, they'd all taken a photo together. And every single CEO and chairman in that meeting was a male. There was not a single female. There was a female there in the photo, and she was the CEO of the Industry Association. The Industry Association is the association that brings together CEOs of all of the operators to discuss the building of infrastructure and the acceleration of the ICT sector in the country. And so she chairs that forum that brings together the change makers and the decision makers in terms of how do we invest in infrastructure in the country, and how do we move forward in terms of bringing down cost to communicate, and how do we ensure fair share, that each and every one of us involved in ICT as organizations give our fair share to ensure acceleration of the industry. Full picture, everybody male, the female was the CEO, and the other female was the Director General of the ICT industry. So that alone was a startling reality, and it was something that we discussed at one of the events later on in the month in August, saying that was not a picture that bodes well for an industry that is such a critical accelerator and enabler of change in this country, because there is no organization or no individual or entity that can live without technology, because everything that needs to be connected has to be digitized.
Yes.
And then, therefore, who is making these decisions? We're much better, I must admit, when I look at Cisco itself, very strong female leadership. The sales country leader is female. I'm the senior director for the continent, female. I look at, even Microsoft, Lillian Barnard, really good friend, really powerful leader, who is female. So when I do cast my mind to some of the organizations who are doing phenomenal things, CFO, Vodacom, female, RICB, when I look at, some of the other organizations, I think of a very good friend of mine, Sitima Basokoyana, female MTN board, Nosipo Molope, female MTN board. So we're making headways. There are some changes being made, but not quickly enough, Gail. We've still got a long, long way to go.
What do you think a board should be mindful of when making these appointments?
Boards should be mindful about the geopolitical challenges that we are confronted and faced with. And they should be mindful of the fact that when these geopolitical challenges confront us, it's not going to be, as I said earlier, the voice of one person that needs to be the reason. You need, and there's no one person who's going to solve global challenges. I mean, I just explained earlier when we opened the conversation in terms of the power of people that are involved in some of these conversations and debates and engagements in New York. And it's philanthropists, it's academia, it is global world leaders, it's economists, it is the youth. There were so many young people who were at these entities and organizations. It was so many, it's people with disabilities. There were just so many phenomenal people ranging in, knowledge, skill, development, personalities. There were just so many different forces that were actually brought to these conversations. And that's what boards need to think of. Boards need to actually understand that they need to capacitate themselves like a country. There's no country that has one skill or one ability. When citizens of a country come together and they decide that we would like to drive and enact change. And that's when real change happens. It's not, because there's one person who's leading a change. Even if one person comes up and inspires change, they themselves need a collaborative group to actually move forward with them, to actually ensure that there is a catalytic change that happens. So again, these are things that boards need to take into account. And again, I'm always struck and I marvel at how, regardless of the conversation or board I walk into, I also serve as a member of We Think Code. It's a movement, an NGO that actually drives technical change and transformation, where we actually bring forth youngsters who didn't have an ability to go to a coding school or a coding university, and they don't have funding. We raise funds from sponsors to actually put these youngsters through coding and boot camps, and they are then placed in top organizations to actually be their software developers, their designers. They are actually placed to make big change when it comes to technology in organizations. And I always marvel how I'm never the smartest person in the room. In fact, I can't ever remember being the smartest person in the room for anything. Even at my school, I was always either number one or two. And when I was number one, there was always somebody who was just behind me by a percentage or a point, and very quickly they would overtake me, and that excites me. And that's what boards should be striving to be. We should never ever get comfortable enough to think or settle on the fact that I've reached my ultimate destination. There should always be more that they should be pushing to include and pushing to drive. And gone are the days where boards are just run on sheer finances. There's so many governance imperatives that are now facing us. There are just so many technological imperatives that are facing us. And most importantly, there's so many ethical considerations that we now need to consider. And when we look at